Robert Hensley stood outside his daughter's hotel room in a suit he'd only worn twice before, holding a small blue box he'd carried in his jacket pocket all morning, when Rachel opened the door with red eyes and said the words he never thought he'd hear from her. "Dad, I need you to leave. Not the ceremony, not the building. Leave." He didn't move at first. He just stood there in the hallway, holding a box that held his late wife's earrings, the ones Rachel was supposed to wear that afternoon, and waited for his daughter to tell him she was joking. She wasn't joking. "Please," she said. "Just for today. I'll explain later. I promise." Behind her, through the half-open door, he could see a stranger's mother fixing a veil that cost more than his first truck. He nodded once, the way he always did when something hurt too much to argue about, and he turned around and walked back down that hotel hallway alone. What Rachel didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that every flower, every chair, every string light hanging over the reception lawn had been paid for by the man she'd just asked to disappear. That story starts 3 months earlier on an ordinary Tuesday in a bank on the edge of a small town in North Carolina, where a 64-year-old retired plumber sat across from a loan officer and asked a question that would change everything. "How much can I get for the land? My name is Robert Hensley. Everyone calls me Bob. I spent 39 years running pipe and fixing water heaters in and around Buncombe County, and I raised one daughter mostly on my own after my wife Diane passed 4 years ago from a heart that gave out too soon." Rachel was 24 when we lost her mother. She's 28 now, and she is, without question, the best thing I ever helped build. I'm not a rich man. I never wanted to be. I wanted a paid-off truck, a house with good water pressure, and a daughter who knew she was loved. 2 out of 3 isn't bad, considering how life goes. When Rachel called to tell me she was engaged to a man named Tyler Whitfield, I was happy for her before I even knew his last name. Then I found out whose son he was, and happy turned into something more complicated. The Whitfields owned half of the commercial real estate between Asheville and Hendersonville. Big house on a hill with a gate that opened by itself. A mother, Deborah, who wore pearls to the grocery store. A father, Gordon, who talked about golf like it was a religion. Tyler seemed like a decent enough young man, a little unsure of himself around his own parents, but decent. He looked at Rachel the way I used to look at her mother, and that told me most of what I needed to know. Then came the wedding planning. And that's when I learned exactly how big the gap was between the world I raised my daughter in and the world she was marrying into. The first number Rachel mentioned, almost apologetically, over coffee at my kitchen table, was $85,000. She said it the way you'd mention a rough weather forecast, quiet, hoping it might just pass over. "Deborah has a vision," she said. "The Magnolia Estate, string lights over the whole back lawn, a live quartet during dinner. She says it needs to feel like the Whitfield family since half the guests will be Tyler's father's business associates." "And what does it need to feel like for you?" I asked. Rachel looked down at her coffee for a long moment before she answered. "I just want to marry him, Dad. I don't care about the flowers." But I could see it in her face. She cared. Not about the flowers. About not embarrassing Tyler in front of people who mattered to his career, to his family's name, to a future she was terrified of getting wrong before it even started. I asked how much she and Tyler had saved. $12,000, she said quietly. "Tyler's still paying off his MBA, and I don't want to ask his parents for more than they're already offering." "What are they offering?" "They said they'd cover a third if we scaled it down. But Deborah doesn't want it scaled down." I did the math in my head while she wasn't looking. Something wasn't adding up, and it wasn't going to add up on $12,000 and a third of 85. That night, after Rachel drove home, I sat alone at that same kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing numbers of my own. I had 40 acres out past Fairview that Diane's grandfather had left us years ago. Good land, mostly wooded, worth more now than either of us ever imagined. Back when we used to talk about maybe building a cabin on it someday. I had my retirement account, modest but real, 39 years of careful saving. I had a truck I didn't need 2 of, and a boat I hadn't taken out on the lake in 3 years. None of it was Rachel's business to know about. Not yet. Maybe not ever. 2 weeks later, I sat down with a wedding planner named Carol Ann Whitmore, a woman with kind eyes and a very quiet way of doing business, and I told her exactly what I wanted. "I want to cover the difference," I said. All of it, if that's what it takes. But nobody can know it came from me. Not the Whitfields. Not Rachel. Carol Ann studied me for a moment. Most fathers who do this want at least a little credit, Mr. Hensley. I don't need credit, I said. I need my daughter to walk down that aisle without owing anybody an apology for who her family is. And we worked out an arrangement. Every vendor invoice would route through Carol Ann's office. She'd tell Rachel and the Whitfields that a portion of the wedding was being funded through, in her words, family arrangements on the bride's side, vague enough to be true and specific enough to end most questions. I would wire the funds directly to her escrow account as each deposit came due. My name would never appear on a single contract. I sold the 40 acres in November. Diane would have hated that, I think. Or maybe she would have understood completely. I like to believe it was the second one. I pulled $22,000 out of retirement, more than I should have, and I told myself I'd make it back working part-time inspections for a few more years than I'd planned. I sold the boat to a fishing buddy for less than it was worth because I needed the check that week, not next month. By the second week of December, I had wired just over $60,000 into an account with my daughter's wedding, written nowhere on any piece of paper connected to my name. Nobody at that family knew a working man from a two-bedroom house on Maple Hollow Road had just quietly paid for most of their daughter-in-law's dream wedding. I told myself that was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't know yet how much that silence was going to cost me. So the wedding was set for the second Saturday in April at the Magnolia Estate, a sprawling old plantation-style property with white columns and gardens that looked like something out of a magazine Deborah Whitfield probably subscribed to on purpose. I drove past it once in February just to see the place my daughter would get married, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long while, imagining Rachel walking across that lawn in her mother's veil. That image kept me warm through a long winter of watching my savings shrink and telling nobody why. As the wedding got closer, I started noticing things in Rachel's voice on our phone calls. A tiredness that wasn't about planning stress, something quieter and heavier underneath it. Deborah wants the seating chart finalized by Friday, she told me one evening in February. She keeps changing where everyone sits. That's her right to worry about, I suppose, I said. She moved you, Rachel said, and then stopped herself. Moved me where? Nothing, Dad. It's fine. It's just seating. But it wasn't just seating, and we both knew it. Over the following weeks, in small comments Rachel probably didn't even realize she was making, I started building a picture of what fine actually meant. I'd been moved from the family table to a table near the back, closer to the caterer's staging area than to my own daughter. Deborah had asked, gently but firmly, whether I owned something a little more current than the one gray suit I'd mentioned wearing, the same suit I'd worn to Diane's funeral and to Rachel's college graduation. At the tasting dinner, which I wasn't invited to, apparently Gordon Whitfield had made a joke about blue-collar in-laws that made the table laugh in a way Rachel described to me later as not really about you, Dad. Don't worry about it. I worried about it anyway. Quietly. The way I did everything. I never said a word to Rachel about any of it. Not because I wasn't hurt, because I could hear something in her voice those weeks that worried me more than my own pride ever could. My daughter sounded like a woman trying very hard to keep two worlds from colliding, and I didn't want to be the reason they finally did. 6 weeks before the wedding, Rachel called me on a Sunday night, and I could tell before she said a word that she'd been crying. Dad, can I ask you something and you have to promise not to be upset? I promise, I said, already knowing I probably wouldn't be able to keep it. Deborah thinks it might be less complicated if Gordon walks me down the aisle, since he'll be, introducing me to everyone as family for the first time in that setting. She says it would mean a lot to Tyler's side. I sat very still in my kitchen, phone pressed hard against my ear, and for a moment I didn't trust my own voice. What do you want? I finally asked. There was a long pause on the line. I want you to walk me down the aisle, Dad, obviously. But I also want this whole thing to stop feeling like a war I'm losing every single day. Then tell her no, I said, gently as I could. It's not that simple. Tyler's whole family is helping pay for this. I can't just... She stopped herself again. I heard it. The half-sentence hanging in the air between us, the truth she almost said and then swallowed back down. I could have told her right then. I could have said, Rachel, they're not paying for most of this. I am. You don't owe them a single thing you don't want to give. I didn't say it. I told myself I was protecting her from feeling guilty, from feeling like she owed me something too. Looking back, I think I was also protecting myself from an answer I wasn't ready to hear. The answer to whether my daughter would still want a plumber walking her down that aisle if there was a wealthier option standing beside him. I'll walk you down the aisle, I said instead. We'll figure the rest out. Thank you, Dad. Her voice cracked on those two words in a way that told me this fight had already cost her more than she was telling me. I didn't know it then, but that Sunday night phone call was the last easy conversation we'd have before the wedding. The next 6 weeks moved fast, the way things do when you're both dreading and hoping for the same date. I kept wiring money through Carol Ann's office. Final catering deposit, floral balance, the band's remaining fee. Every transfer felt like handing over another small piece of my old life, the boat, the land, 20 years of retirement contributions. In exchange for one perfect afternoon I wasn't sure I'd even be allowed to fully stand inside of anymore. 3 weeks before the wedding, Carol Ann called me with a small, careful warning in her voice. Mr. Hensley, I wanted to give you a heads up, says. Mrs. Whitfield has been asking more questions about the funding structure. She's noticed the numbers don't quite match what her family contributed, plus what the bride and groom saved. I've kept your name out of it, as promised, but I think she suspects there's a third party involved somewhere. Let her suspect, I said, as long as it doesn't land on Rachel's shoulders. It might, Carol Ann said quietly. Say, these things have a way of finding the person who can least afford to carry them. I didn't understand what she meant until the week of the wedding. Rachel flew in from Charlotte on Wednesday. I picked her up at the airport myself, and for a few hours in my truck, driving those familiar mountain roads, she sounded like my daughter again instead of a woman negotiating a peace treaty between two families. We stopped at the diner on Tunnel Road, the one her mother used to take her to after dance recitals, and she ordered the same milkshake she'd been ordering there since she was 12 years old. I miss this, she said, looking out the window at the mountains going gray in the evening light. I miss when things were simple. They can still be simple, I told her. You just have to decide what actually matters and let the rest go. She smiled at me the way she used to when she was small, and I'd said something she thought was wiser than it probably was. I didn't know that smile was the last easy one I'd get from her for several very long days. Thursday brought the rehearsal dinner, held at a restaurant Gordon Whitfield owned, a piece of all dark wood and low lighting and a menu with no prices printed on it. I sat near the end of a long table, 3 seats down from my own daughter, and listened to Gordon give a toast about legacy and family name that never once mentioned Diane, never once mentioned me, as though Rachel had simply appeared in the world fully formed, ready, made for the Whitfield family tree. I clapped anyway. Rachel caught my eye across the table once, an apology written all over her face that she didn't need to give me, and I gave her a small nod back that I hoped said, I'm fine. Don't worry about your old man. I wasn't entirely fine, but some things a father learns to carry quietly, so his children don't have to carry them at all. Friday, the day before the wedding, was when everything spent 3 months trying to protect finally started to crack. I was in my hotel room that evening going over Carol Ann's final invoice one last time, confirming the last wire transfer that would cover Saturday's remaining balance, when my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Can you come to my room? Need to talk. Please don't be upset. 5 words that had never once in 28 years meant anything good. I put on my jacket, the same gray one from Diane's funeral, tucked the small blue box with her earrings into the inside pocket, and walked down 2 flights to my daughter's hotel room, telling myself whatever it was, we'd figure it out the way we always had. I had no idea I was about to lose my seat at my own daughter's wedding before it had even begun. Rachel opened the door, already crying. Mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes, and behind her I could see Deborah Whitfield standing near the window with her arms crossed, watching us both like a woman supervising a difficult business meeting. Dad, Rachel said, and her voice broke on that single word. I need to ask you something, and I need you to just trust me. Anything, I said, and I meant it. God help me, I meant it completely. Deborah is worried that with Gordon's business partners here, and some very specific people from Tyler's world, that having you seated up front, walking me down, some of it might come across as," she stopped, looked at the carpet, "might send the wrong message about the family Tyler is marrying into." I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. "The wrong message," I repeated. "It's not what you think," Rachel said quickly. "It's not about you as a person, Dad. It's about optics. There's a deal Tyler's father is closing next month with some very traditional, very image-conscious investors. And Deborah is scared that if certain details about the wedding look inconsistent with the Whitfield brand, it could actually hurt Tyler's future, his whole career. So I'm bad for the brand," I said quietly. "Dad, please don't say it like that." Deborah finally spoke from across the room, her voice smooth and practiced, the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime softening hard things into something that sounded almost reasonable. "Mr. Hensley, we would never ask this if it weren't truly necessary. We simply feel it would be less complicated, less noticeable, if you weren't present for the ceremony and the early part of the reception. You're more than welcome to join us later, quietly, once the important photographs and introductions are complete. Less noticeable." Those were her exact words. I have never forgotten them. I looked at my daughter, waiting for her to say something, anything, that told me she disagreed. She didn't. She just stood there with tears sliding down her face, caught between the man who raised her and the family she was terrified of disappointing on the biggest day of her life. "Please," Rachel finally whispered, "just for the ceremony. I'll explain everything after. I promise." I thought about telling them both, right there in that hotel room, exactly how much of that wedding existed because of me. The 40 acres, the boat, the retirement I'd need years longer now to rebuild. I thought about it for one long, burning moment. Then I looked at my daughter's face, exhausted and frightened and caught in the middle of something far bigger than a seating chart, and I made a decision I would spend the rest of that day wondering whether I'd made correctly. "Okay," I said quietly, "for you, not for them." I set the small blue box on the dresser by the door, Diane's earrings, without a word of explanation, and I turned around and walked out of that hotel room and down the hallway, leaving my only daughter's wedding day before it had even started. I didn't go back to my own room right away. I walked outside into the parking lot, into cool April air that smelled like rain coming, and I sat down on a low stone wall near the hotel entrance. And for the first time since Diane's funeral, I let myself cry without caring who might see an old man falling apart in a parking lot. I stayed there for almost an hour, long enough to watch the wedding party's cars start arriving for the next morning's setup, long enough to see a caterer's van pull in and a young man start unloading crates of champagne glasses that I had personally paid for, glasses that would be raised in toasts I wasn't going to be allowed to hear. Around 9 that night, my phone rang. Carol Ann Whitmore. "Mr. Hensley, I'm so sorry to call this late. I just wanted to confirm we're still good for tomorrow's final settlement transfer. The venue and caterer both need the balance cleared by 9 a.m. or they'll pause final setup." I sat on that stone wall a long moment before I answered her. Something in me, wounded and tired and finally out of patience, made a decision I would come to regret and understand in equal measure over the following 24 hours. "Carol Ann," I said quietly, "hold the transfer, just for now. Mr. Hensley, I'm not saying cancel it," I said. "I'm saying wait until I call you back. I need some time to think." I hung up before she could ask me why. I wasn't entirely sure I could have explained it to her anyway. I only knew that a man who had just been quietly erased from his daughter's wedding day needed, for a few hours at least, to hold on to the one piece of power he still had left. I checked into a motel 11 miles down the road that night instead of going back to my own hotel room, needing distance more than I needed comfort, and I lay awake most of the night staring at a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, asking myself the same question over and over. Had I just protected my daughter's wedding, or had I just set fire to it? Saturday morning arrived gray and soft, the kind of April morning that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. I sat in that motel room until almost noon, watching the clock, my phone silent on the nightstand, and I told myself Rachel didn't need me there, that she'd asked me to disappear, and I was simply doing what my daughter had asked. At 11:47, my phone rang. Carol Ann again, her voice tighter than it had been the night before. "Mr. Hensley, I need you to release that final transfer. The venue is holding setup. The caterer's truck is sitting in the parking lot with the appetizers going warm. I have 45 minutes before this becomes a real problem in front of 200 guests. I closed my eyes. Give me 10 minutes, I said. I sat on the edge of that motel bed with my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over the banking app. 40 acres and a boat and years of retirement savings compressed down into one final decision. And I thought about Rachel at 8 years old, riding on my shoulders at the county fair, laughing all so hard she nearly fell off. I thought about her at 16, crying in the passenger seat of my truck after her first heartbreak. And me driving in silence because sometimes the only thing a father can do is just be there, present, steady, even when he has no answers. Whatever had happened in that hotel room the night before, whatever Deborah Whitfield thought about optics and brands and less noticeable fathers, none of that was Rachel's fault. Not really. She was 28 and scared and caught between two families. And I was 64 and supposed to know better than to let my pride cost her the wedding she'd been dreaming about since she was a little girl, planning it with paper dolls on our kitchen floor. I released the transfer. Then I got in my truck, and against every instinct telling me to stay away, I drove back toward the Magnolia estate. I didn't go inside. I told myself I just needed to see it, needed to know the day was actually happening the way it was supposed to. I parked at the far edge of the gravel lot behind a row of catering vans, close enough to hear the string quartet warming up somewhere beyond the garden wall, close enough to see white chairs lined up in careful rows across a lawn turning green with spring. I sat there in my truck through the entire ceremony. I couldn't see my daughter walk down that aisle. I could only imagine it the way I'd imagined it back in February sitting in this same parking lot. Except now I imagined it with Gordon Whitfield's arm where mine should have been. Around 1:30, as the ceremony ended and applause drifted faintly across the lawn, my phone rang. Carol Ann, and this time her voice had an edge in it I hadn't heard before. Mr. Hensley, I don't know how to say this except plainly. The catering balance you released this morning, it bounced back as declined about 20 minutes ago. Some kind of hold flag from your bank. I've got a caterer standing in that kitchen right now telling the venue coordinator he can't confirm the second course is going out unless someone settles the account in the next half hour. My stomach dropped. In the chaos of that morning, in the tangled mess of pride and love and 45 minutes of pressure, I hadn't accounted for one simple fact. My bank had flagged the transfer as unusual activity, a fraud protection hold triggered by the size and timing of the transaction, and it had frozen the exact payment I'd finally painfully agreed to send. I'll call them right now, I said, already fumbling for my banking app. Mr. Hensley, Carol Ann said carefully, there's something else you should know. Mrs. Whitfield overheard the coordinator on the phone with the caterer. She's asking questions, specific questions, about whose account this payment is even coming from. I've tried to keep this contained, but I think it's about to come out. I sat in that parking lot with my phone against my ear, watching wedding guests in pastel dresses and dark suits start drifting across the lawn toward the reception tent, and I understood, with a sinking certainty, that the secret I had spent 3 months and nearly everything I owned protecting was about to unravel in front of 200 people, including my own daughter. I called my bank, sat on hold for what felt like an hour but was probably 11 minutes, explaining to a very patient customer service representative named Marcus that yes, this was really me. Yes, I really did intend to transfer that amount. No, I was not a victim of fraud. I was simply a father who'd made a very expensive, very complicated decision about his only daughter's wedding day. Marcus released the hold at 2:14 in the afternoon. By then, the damage inside that reception tent had already been done. I found out what happened during that window from Rachel herself, hours later, but I'll tell it here so you understand exactly how the truth finally found its way into the light. At 1:52, in the middle of cocktail hour, the venue coordinator had pulled Deborah Whitfield aside, apologizing profusely, explaining there was a hold on the final catering balance and asking, delicately, whether the Whitfield family could cover the gap temporarily while the issue with the other contributing party got resolved. Deborah, who had spent 3 months quietly suspecting a mystery third party funder without ever being told his name, finally demanded a straight answer. "Whose account is this?" she asked the coordinator, loud enough that a few nearby guests turned to look. "I want a name." The coordinator, flustered and cornered, gave her the only name on file, Robert Hensley. Rachel was standing 8 feet away, holding a champagne glass she hadn't yet tasted, when she heard her own father's name spoken like the answer to a scandal. She told me later that for about 10 full seconds, she genuinely thought there must be some mistake, some other Robert Hensley, some clerical error. Then Carol Ann, who had been quietly protecting my privacy for 3 months, found herself standing in front of the bride with no good choice left except the truth. "Rachel," she said gently, pulling her aside near the edge of the tent, "I think it's time you knew something." Rachel found me 20 minutes later, still sitting in my truck at the edge of the gravel lot, wedding music drifting faintly across the parking lot, my phone finally showing the transfer had cleared. She walked up in her wedding dress, hem already damp from the grass, veil pushed back off her face, and she knocked on my window with a look I had never once seen on my daughter in 28 years. Not anger. Something closer to grief mixed with disbelief. I rolled the window down. "Is it true?" she asked, before I could even say hello. Carol Ann said, "Dad, is it true you paid for all of this, the land, your retirement? Is that true?" I sat there for a moment, caught between 3 months of careful silence and a daughter standing in front of me in a wedding dress asking for the truth I'd worked so hard to protect her from. "Rachel," I said quietly, "get in the truck." She hesitated, glanced back toward the tent, toward 200 guests and a mother-in-law who'd just spent the last 30 minutes learning a truth she clearly hadn't been ready for either. And then she opened the passenger door and climbed in beside me, wedding dress and all, the way she used to climb into that same truck as a little girl. "Talk to me," she said. "Please." So I did. I told her everything. The 40 acres from her mother's grandfather, the boat, the retirement account I'd need years longer now to rebuild. I told her about the arrangement with Carol Ann, about wanting her to walk down that aisle without owing anyone an apology for where she came from. I told her about the hotel room the night before, about Deborah's request, about the small blue box with her mother's earrings I'd left on the dresser without a word. I told her, finally, about the bank hold that morning, about how my own hurt pride had accidentally frozen a payment I'd already decided to make, about how I never meant for any of this to come apart in front of her wedding guests. Rachel sat very still in that passenger seat for a long time after I finished, tears sliding silently down her face, ruining makeup that had probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. "You sold Grandma Whitmore's land," she finally whispered. That was Diane's grandfather's land, the one Rachel used to call by that name as a little girl. "Dad, that was supposed to be yours. Mom loved that land. Your mother would have sold it herself if it meant you got the day you deserved," I said. "I'm certain of that. Why didn't you just tell me?" I looked at my daughter, 28 years old, married as of about 45 minutes ago to a man I genuinely believed loved her, sitting beside me in a wedding dress in the front seat of an old work truck. And I gave her the only honest answer I had. "Because I didn't want you to marry into a family wondering whether you were only there because your father bought your seat at the table," I said. "I wanted you to walk in there knowing you belonged, full stop. Not because of money, because you're Rachel Hensley, and that has always been more than enough." She put her face in her hands and cried for a long moment, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much older than one bad afternoon. Then she looked up at me, mascara smudged all down her cheeks, and she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "I asked you to disappear on the one day I most needed you standing next to me, and you did it anyway, because I asked. You're my daughter," I said simply. "I'd have done a lot worse than stand outside a reception tent if it meant protecting your day." Rachel wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing what little makeup remained, and reached for the truck door handle. "Come inside," she said. "Right now. Whatever Deborah thinks about optics, she can think it somewhere else today." I hesitated. "Rachel, I don't want to make a scene at your—" "Dad," she said, cutting me off with a firmness I hadn't heard from her in years, maybe ever. "You paid for this entire wedding. You are the scene. and I am done pretending otherwise. I followed my daughter back across that gravel lot, back toward a reception tent full of string lights and 200 guests, who had just spent the last half hour whispering about a name none of them had expected to hear. The moment we stepped inside, the room went quiet. In that particular way, a room goes quiet when everyone already knows something is about to happen and nobody's quite sure what. Deborah Whitfield stood near the head table, champagne glass in hand, her face carefully arranged into something that wanted to look composed and wasn't quite managing it. Rachel didn't wait for an introduction. She walked straight to the small stage where the band had paused mid-song, picked up the microphone the best man had used for his toast 20 minutes earlier, and looked out over 200 faces, her father standing quietly beside her in a gray suit that had been to a funeral and a graduation, and now finally a wedding it had almost been asked to miss. "I want to say something," Rachel said, her voice shaking slightly, but growing steadier with every word. "A lot of you have been wondering about a name you overheard about an hour ago. Robert Hensley. That's my dad." A murmur moved through the crowd. Gordon Whitfield set his drink down slowly. Tyler, standing near the edge of the dance floor, looked from his new wife to his mother with an expression that told me this particular truth was as new to him as it had been to Rachel 20 minutes earlier. "My dad sold land that's been in our family for 3 generations," Rachel continued. "He cashed out part of his retirement. He sold his boat. He did all of it quietly without asking for a single thank you, because he wanted me to have this day without ever feeling like I owed anyone an apology for where I came from." She paused, and I watched my daughter's eyes find Deborah's across that tent. "And this morning, some people in this family asked him to stay away from my ceremony because they were worried about how he might look to your business partners." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. I felt heat rise up the back of my neck, but Rachel wasn't finished. "My father spent 39 years fixing pipes and water heaters so I could go to college. He raised me alone after my mom died. He gave up everything he had left, including land my mother loved, so that today could happen exactly the way it did. And this morning, I let him disappear because I was scared of disappointing people who have never once had to sell anything they love to give someone else a good life." She turned, looked at me standing awkwardly near the edge of that small stage, and her voice finally broke. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have said no to them the moment they asked. You've never once in my whole life asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I am. And today I asked you to be invisible. That was wrong, and I am so sorry." The tent was completely silent except for the soft rustle of string lights swaying in the evening breeze. I walked up to that small stage, took the microphone gently from my daughter's hand, and looked out at 200 strangers, most of them people whose names I'd never learn, some of them people I'd come to know and even like over the years that followed. "I don't need an apology," I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "I need everybody in this tent to understand one thing. This isn't about money, and it was never supposed to be about money. My daughter is the finest thing I ever had a hand in raising, and if loving her meant selling every last thing I own, I'd do it again tomorrow without blinking." I looked over at Deborah Whitfield, who was staring down at the floor, now cheeks flushed. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand wanting the best for your son's wedding. I wanted the same thing for my daughter. We just went about it in very different ways. I hope, moving forward, we can find a way to want good things for these 2 kids without needing to erase each other to get there." Deborah looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something in her face that wasn't managed or practiced, something closer to shame. "Mr. Hensley," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the suddenly still tent, "I owe you an apology. A real one. I let my own fear about how things looked get in the way of what actually mattered today. I'm sorry. It wasn't a perfect moment. Life rarely gives you those. But it was honest, and in a family that had spent 3 months hiding behind seating charts and vague explanations, honest felt like more than enough." The band started playing again a few minutes later, something slow, and Rachel turned to me with her hand outstretched. "They already did the father-daughter dance without you," she said, tears still bright in her eyes. "I want to do it again, properly, if that's okay." I set down the microphone, took my daughter's hand, and led her out onto that dance floor in front of 200 guests, most of whom had spent the last hour learning more about our family than they'd ever expected to know at a wedding reception. "I still have your mother's earrings," I said quietly as we danced. "Left them on the dresser." "I know," Rachel said, resting her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was small enough for me to carry up to bed. "I put them on the second I found out the truth. I've been wearing them the whole time you thought you'd missed the ceremony." I looked down, and sure enough, there they were, small gold studs catching the light from the string lights overhead, the last piece of her mother I'd been able to give her that day. "Your mother would have loved this dress," I said. "She would have loved you more," Rachel answered. "For all of it." We danced through the rest of that song without saying much else, because sometimes love doesn't need many words. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to stand quietly in a parking lot, holding everything he has left, waiting to be let back in. The months after the wedding weren't instantly easy. Deborah and I remain to this day more polite than close, though something did shift between us that afternoon that never fully closed back up again. Gordon shook my hand at the end of the reception and told me gruffly that he respected a man who put his money where his love was. I took that as close to an apology as Gordon Whitfield was ever going to offer, and I let it be enough. Tyler came to see me alone about 2 weeks later, sat at my kitchen table, where his mother-in-law had once sketched out an $85,000 wedding on a napkin, and told me he was ashamed he hadn't known where the money was coming from, shamed he hadn't asked harder questions, shamed he'd let his family push my seat to the back of that room in the first place. "I love your daughter," he told me. "I want to be the kind of husband who never lets that happen to her again." I believed him. I still do. Rachel and I talk more now than we did before the wedding, strange as that sounds. She calls most Sundays, sometimes just to talk about nothing, the way we used to before the world got complicated with seating charts and family names and other people's opinions about what a father is supposed to look like at his own daughter's wedding. Last spring, almost exactly a year after that ceremony, Rachel and Tyler drove out to the piece of land I'd sold, the 40 acres that had belonged to Diane's grandfather. It turned out the new owners hadn't built anything on it yet, and when Rachel asked, gently, whether I'd want to buy back a small corner of it someday, just enough for a little cabin, I told her the truth. I didn't need the land back. I'd already gotten everything that land was ever really worth. I got to watch my daughter get married exactly the way she deserved to. And in the end, when it mattered most, I got to walk her down that aisle after all, if not physically, then in every way that ever really counted. If you've ever given more than anyone realized to protect someone you love, quietly, without ever asking for thanks, I hope you know this. Love like that doesn't disappear just because nobody sees it right away. Sometimes it just waits, patiently, for the truth to finally catch up. Has someone in your own family ever sacrificed more than anyone realized, just to make sure you had what you needed? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If this story reminded you of your own father, or of a love that never asked for credit, consider leaving a like so more people can find stories like this one. And if you know someone who has ever quietly given up everything for their family, send this to them today. They deserve to know it was seen. We believe stories about quiet love and second chances deserve to be told well. If stories like these matter to you, we'd be honored to have you stay a while longer with us. Thank you for spending this time with me today.